you for joining today's webinar. I'm delighted to invite you to this event, which will focus on can civil society afford to care about climate change? And this is part of ACEVO's Climate Week. And this is a week of focused content on encouraging leaders to take action on climate change. For those that don't know me, I'm Shireen and I'm the Policy and Influencing Officer here at ACEVO. ACEVO is a membership body for charity chief executives, and together with our network, we aim to inspire and support civil society leaders through connection, skills, and influence. You can find out more on our website, where you can also find details of our annual conference being held in March next year and of our climate-focused activities. So ACEVO has a track record of working with its members and broader civil society to encourage action on climate change. And back in 2019, we declared a climate crisis and have since been working to provide more information and drive stronger climate leadership across the charity sector. Today's webinar will be chaired by Andrew Brown, Executive Director at the Veolia Environmental Trust and a member of our Climate Crisis Working Group. Andrew will be speaking to Mamta Borgoyary, Executive Director at She Changes Climate, and Caroline Macfarland, Founder and Director at Common Vision. So before we begin, a few housekeeping matters. Please do introduce yourselves in the chat. Just check that you're sending the message to everyone, as sometimes it defaults to host panelists, which means other attendees can't see it. Please do use the Q&A option for questions. You can upvote and comment on other people's questions if you want via this function. We will be recording this event, and Otter AI and Zoom closed captions are available by clicking on the link at the top of your screen. That's all from me, and I hope you enjoyed today's event, and it's my pleasure to now hand over to today's chair, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Shireen, and hello to everyone. Thank you for joining us. As Shireen said, I'm Andrew Brown. I'm the Executive Director of the Veolia Environmental Trust, which is a grant-making charity that awards around £5 million per year to community and environmental projects across England, with a very strong focus on empowering communities to take action on the climate and nature crises. I'm also chair of the Association of Distributive Environmental Bodies, which is the membership organisation for funders and stakeholders of the Landfill Communities Fund, which is a UK government tax credit scheme aimed at improving the natural and built environment for communities in the vicinity of landfill sites. Prior to this, I worked for the National Lottery Community Fund for a number of years and was proud to deliver a funding programme called Create Your Space, which empowered communities in Wales to improve their local environment. So the theme of funding civil society to tackle climate change is very much in my DNA, and that's why I'm really honoured to be hosting this discussion today. And I'd like to introduce you to my guests, who are equally, if not more, committed to the cause of empowering ordinary people to take action on climate change. As Shireen said, I'm joined by Mamta Borgoyary, who is the Executive Director of She Changes Climate, and Caroline Macfarland, who is the Founder and Director of Common Vision. So if I could just turn to you first, Mamta, could you just start by telling me a little bit about yourself, about your personal journey in relation to the climate crisis, and how your organisation works in that space?
Thank you so much, Andrew, and very good morning to everyone out here. Well, I'm a trained economist. I started my career in the area of environment economics, particularly looking at action research. To spend about more than 10 years of my life actually looking at different aspects of environment economics. And at a point, I really felt very unsure about what is the impact of the work that I'm doing. And that's when I started feeling extremely restless, wanting to know how can I really create or do more impactful work at the grassroots. That is when I jumped into the civil society sector. Large part of my work has been at the grassroots, working with women and children who are largely affected and reside in the climate vulnerable areas. After about more than 15 years working with at the grassroots, particularly looking at issues of human rights violation, including child trafficking, human trafficking, the whole issue of climate migration, resilience building in livelihood and health. I'm now working as the executive director of She Changes Climate. And for me, this is almost a journey of being able to translate my learnings from the field about hope, about despair, about how women are impacted, yet they are solutions. And I've seen how their voices are not at all present in the decisions that are being made in climate action. So She Changes Climate is a global movement to advocate for women leadership in climate decision making. We are committed to have diverse perspectives of women being included in the climate justice narrative and decision making. And it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mamta. I'm sure those themes of grassroots action on climate change and intersectionality are going to be things that we can tease out in a bit more detail today. So thank you for that. Caroline, same question to you. If you could just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your journey in relation to climate change.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Andrew, and thanks for having me today, to everyone at ACEVO. So I do various bits and pieces of strategic comms and engagement from a sort of political level to engagement with different communities of practice or place. Just over 10 years ago, I set up Common Vision as a think tank specialising in community dialogue on issues which often might become thorny or divisive or intractable or just mind-blowingly boring in both the political and public debate. And last year we actually spun off 2 new brands. So the Better Conversations Initiative, which is all about how you have and hold meaningful conversations with different communities on public issues and how those conversations can lead to action and impact. And we also spun off Common Futures, which works specifically with young people and young adults to influence local and national policy dialogue and lead social action. So over the years, I've led a bunch of different projects under this kind of broad banner of the climate crisis. Things from public understanding on more technical issues like the food system or renewables or ocean health or something like that, to people's emotional and psychological responses to climate change issues, to projects which explore practical community-led solutions to climate and biodiversity loss. So yeah, I'm really interested in the different ways that climate sort of action or the climate crisis may appeal to different population groups and segments, or may really not appeal, and we need to find other ways of framing and communicating these issues.
That's great. Thank you, Caroline. It's really good to hear you both talking about community-led solutions, because I think probably all of our audience will be in that space where what their organisation, whether it be a charity or not-for-profit of some kind, they're all looking to how climate action fits with their service users or beneficiaries or whatever term they use. So hearing that the discussion is going to focus on sort of community-led action is really interesting. So to kick us off then, all of the discussion about climate change tends to start from the assumption that we have to act now, we have to do something quickly. But my question to you is, why is it crucial for civil society in particular to prioritise climate change when there are so many other pressing priorities facing civil society and civil society leaders at the moment? I'll throw that one back to you to begin with, Caroline, if that's okay.
Yeah, I did struggle with the question about prioritising climate change almost against other social issues, as if there's a trade-off in what to prioritise. And I think this is one of the problems with the climate crisis in general. It's seen as something which is in a bucket, another social issue, another social problem for people to have to address and deal with, whereas actually it's more like something which overlays lots and lots of different social issues and challenges. And so I'm not sure it is a case of prioritizing climate change over and above other issues. I think it's seeing the ways in which climate change affects a lot of different other issues, and the ways that addressing it will benefit benefit different communities and different issues in different ways. So there's one thing about a much more holistic picture, acknowledging that the climate crisis can be broken down into lots and lots of different issues, whether it's population health, or whether it is jobs in the economy, or whether it is about people's access to nature and well-being in outdoor spaces. So there's lots and lots of different ways that this can be cut up and addressed. And so I think we need to distill that. We really need to be clear about what this very unwieldy, overwhelming climate crisis thing is, and then start to tackle how it plays out for different types of people, different communities. It's also, we know now that while the climate crisis is something which is really important that we address it, and important that we address it immediately, the language around urgency can put off people, and lots of different people are turned off by the sort of doom and gloom messages about the world's going to end. So I think that civil society, and maybe we can talk about this later, has a really unique opportunity to harness that sense of opportunity, that sense of aspiration, that sense of positivity around climate solutions and climate action, albeit maybe in slightly different terminology, and use the unique strengths of civil society and community organisations to tap into that bit.
That's really interesting, thank you. So I'll come to you then, Mamta, just sort of following on from what Caroline says there. You work with a really broad range of people and different backgrounds. How do you communicate that urgency to them without this sort of attached doom and gloom?
I think, first of all, I would re-emphasize what Caroline is saying. I think that it is very, very important to understand that climate change is not something out there in a box, which is very different. It influences every single thing that we do, and even as a civil society, every work that we do. Climate change is either going to make it much more difficult for us, and it's going to kind of exacerbate the impacts. The second part, I think, as civil societies, there are two roles, basically. There are several roles, but two very important roles across the globe. One is to bridge the lack of service. So you find a lot of organizations of society working with, let's say, government, or working with donors, corporates, to enable access to the service, whether it is health, whether it is education, whether it is livelihood. The other work of civil society is systemic change. And my experience in this sector has been that it is high time, as civil society representative, somebody who worked there, we recognize and streamline this whole concept of the interconnectedness, between climate and the other sectors. So every work that we do, whether we are working in the health sector, whether we are working in the education sector, whether we work in livelihood, climate change is having an impact on the need and the way we respond to it. So I think the language of urgency is not a separate language. I think what Caroline said, it's not a separate narrative that we have to talk and build a narrative on climate change. I think it is important to create the awareness of intersectionality between climate and other sectors, whether it is health, education. And the language, therefore, in which we communicate to civil society organizations, particularly grassroots organizations, because sometimes my experience has been that if you go with them about climate change, the first thing they will say, we do not work on climate change. That's what their response is. That's not where we work. But if you build a narrative and have that conversation about how climate change is very much part of what they do, I think you can, the panic that you create, this is another thing that we have to look at, will kind of slowly disappear. So I think narrative building, is very important in this context. The language communication, the way we are communicating about climate change and the impact, so that it is understandable for any grassroots organization, how it impacts their work. And my experience, Andrew, has been, I have learned from the community of how climate change impacts their life. So I think that it is about the right language, the right communication, drawing the right narrative, and storytelling, the importance of storytelling in a language, in a manner that it can be understood.
Thank you for that. So given that, I think we all agree that sort of climate change spans all these other kind of civil society themes and priorities, whether it's health, whether it's poverty or financial prosperity, and so on. How do we make sure that the action that stems from that, the climate action that we take, is inclusive and equitable? Because it's very easy to say we want a just transition. What does that mean in practice? Caroline, do you want to answer that first?
Yeah, I'm sure that Mamta can speak more about the sort of the equitable side of things. So I might take the inclusive if it's possible to segment. So I think, again, the debate has been hijacked a little bit by, I think, a very top-down narrative about when we talk about the climate crisis. It's about government doing stuff or investing in stuff. And the experts tell us that this needs to happen at a very sort of macro level, whereas there's lots and lots of examples, case studies, stories about community-led initiatives, whether it's cooperative energy or recycling and reuse schemes, or the way that communities can sort of take ownership or control of their local outdoor spaces and kind of wildlife and biodiversity initiatives. So there's loads of stuff that already exists, but often I think that gets put into the sort of the grassroots box, and then when we talk about just transition, we talk about the economy and how it's going to the net zero transition and the economic effects of green jobs or something like that. Again, I think we could have a much more nuanced, sophisticated way of having those discussions and not sort of compartmentalize as much. And ultimately, I think it takes a movement. It takes civil society to see those, albeit smaller scale actions, as part of a joined up picture. And the community energy scheme, or the solar or the wind turbine or whatever it is over there, does connect with what the people are doing on the nature reserve over there and that sort of thing. So I think in terms of sort of ensuring that climate action helps everyone, having a sort of joined up picture is important. In terms of ensuring climate action includes everyone, I think there are lots of ways in which people can be put off by the language around climate action. Often, I think I already said, sort of, there's a lot of stuff that can become very, very technocratic, around, especially around net zero transitions and I don't know, building insulation and things like that. Completely off-putting to someone that just has a normal life and doesn't really interact with any of those sort of technical aspects. And it can also be all about being an activist. you know, where people feel like they have to be an activist or go on a march or do something activisty in order to be taking climate action. Whereas in fact, you know, there are plenty of examples of people interweaving climate actions into their usual community life, their usual civic spaces, you know, the stuff that already goes on in communities. So I think, again, this is where civil society has a very, very unique role and a unique opportunity, in that it already reaches lots and lots of different communities, different population segments, and can appeal to those groups in different ways on their own terms. I definitely recommend a look, if anyone hasn't seen it already, at the work of Climate Outreach on their sort of 7 population segments. And it basically breaks down the population into 7 categories of people, all with different demographics, values, voting behaviours. But the majority of those segments do already care about the issues in different ways, whether it's about sort of, you know, protesting on government stuff, or whether it's about actually, you know, caring about the rural economy and farming, for example, or it could be about taking, you know, slightly different actions depending on what your values are. So that's definitely something that I would say. Inclusivity is important. It needs a different approach for different folks, basically. And understanding what people value and how that relates to the climate crisis.
That's really interesting. Thanks. I very much like the distinction between climate action and climate actions. I think, you know, a lot of our discussion today is about how you make taking action accessible and a natural step. And I think just the addition of that S makes it feel less like having to adopt an entirely new persona and way of working, but rather just sort of taking a first step and doing something. So that's really interesting. Thanks. Mamta, what does an equitable transition look like to you then?
So I'm glad you asked this question, because we just initiated a campaign on a just energy transition, and we are talking about what does it look like to be inclusive, equitable. I think, first of all, what is important is, you know, particularly when you're looking at marginalized communities with whom largely the civil society works, the narrative has always been of victim. So even in just transition, the approach for even a very proactive government has always been about addressing this whole issue of them as victims. My experience shows that as much as they are victims, it is the community who are also the solution providers. I think in just transition, there's a huge role for including marginalized communities, and our work has been more looking at women and gender. In deciding where the investments would go. B, there's a huge scope of developing entrepreneurship, women entrepreneurship, or, you know, entrepreneurship focused around marginalized communities along this energy process. And there is already enough evidence to show, and again, I will talk about women here, all over the world, particularly in Global South, that women have shown far better entrepreneurial responses when it comes to shifting from traditional economic systems to, you know, maybe a different alternative economic systems. In the area of solar energy, for example, in India itself, there's so much of example of how women are much more forthcoming and much more entrepreneurial risk takers when it comes to providing solutions, particularly to using non-conventional sources, ways of working. So I think in just transition, there's a huge role to create momentum by including the marginalized communities. And if you look at the Global South, the percentage of them, it's a huge percentage of marginalized communities. And this includes different kinds. I mean, I'm not boxing them in one. And then by that, it gives you also the supply base. Your base is so broad and big that this whole job of getting the transition, the returns from the transition, which we will be much more balanced if we look at it that way. So that's one part. And I just coming to, I would like to add on to what Caroline talked about, inclusion, the importance of inclusion. And even in just transition, it is very important that we play two roles. And again, I'll come to civil society. One is advocacy from at the top level. The NDCs, I mean, the last time I think they reviewed the NDCs, only less than 10% of the country action plans represented any word on, say, gender as a word in their plan. There's a huge need, requirement to really demand. It is time that we demand a role and appropriate investments into women-led action, women-focused action. The second part that I think is, and which is very important, is as civil society, political will, and how can civil society really play an important role in promoting political wills, when there is political will to include, to be inclusive, the actions are much more definite. And that's another challenge that I think is very important and should be in the agenda of the civil society.
Thank you for that. Is there a risk, with a just transition, is there a risk that those who want to slow down climate action or dissuade others from taking climate action, is there a risk that those people latch onto the term just transition and use it as a bit of a handbrake? Because I'm thinking of this from the point of view of, we've already said that the very demographic that's going to be most affected by climate change have the most to lose. And if somebody comes along to them and says, well, climate action is going to be painful, you're going to lose out a lot, it's going to cost, there's only so much money to go around and you're going to lose out. Does that risk kind of slowing the whole process down or turning those people away from climate action? That's probably one back to you, Mamta.
Well, I think that's not true, that, just transition is not economically remunerated. I think there's a whole lot of false stories being kind of floating around that just transition is going to lead to, is risky and will lead to economic losses. There is scientific evidence already that if you shift to just transition, it is much more profitable, associated economic growth, everything is much more better than what it is right now. Yes, there is a chance because, again, I think it is about creating this atmosphere of fear and risks and false stories. I think it is high time now that we should really put what is being done in the academic world in research, which never gets translated, which seldom gets translated, I should say, into pieces which are perceivable, can be user advocacy, can be really taken up to develop and change mindsets. There's a huge gap, and we really need to come out with the real story of just transition and what it means. For long, because of the vested interest of few, there's been a huge false story circulated around. And and this has happened, like I said, there are those, the climate crisis skeptics who do not believe in it. But science is telling you again and again, even where IPCC reports are now talking about, science is telling you that we'll be doomed. But still, these stories, where do these stories reside? Where are they going? Why is it not in the public space? Why is it not with the right-minded industrialists who would like to change, who would like to shift? I think that there is a real lack of the real story of an adjusted transition out in public space. And that is something which should reduce the risks, associated risks and fear that is centered around it.
And just to follow up on that, in terms of the link between the academic research and evidence and the storytelling piece, I think, it is easy to get sort of bogged down in the will it, won't it trade-off between one specific policy, initiative or something. I mean, we saw it with ULEZ in London, like who will be hit the hardest by this, and lots of people very, I have a lot of empathy for, people who go, yes, I will be hit really hard by this. This is not fair. But there are other things that we don't hear about. So awareness of the sort of co-benefits of climate action is very, very low, but a lot of kind of academic research has been done on it. So co-benefits, things like the public health benefits of different initiatives, things like cleaner air or healthier food, lower costs for the NHS, having more or different jobs, cleaner cities, greener spaces, and different ways of that all interacts with sort of systems of poverty and inequality. But we don't hear that enough. We kind of get bogged down in, is this one initiative going to lead to more or less pound in the pocket for these people over there, rather than these are the benefits that everyone can gain from, and this outweighs the costs in this in various ways. So yeah, just having a different way of telling those stories is important.
I'd like to turn to the sort of politics of climate action and some of the barriers, and just pick up on what you've just said, actually, about how we flip the conversation from problems to co-benefits, because I think we are still very much, even our discussion today, most of my questions are around problematic things, but how do you change the narrative? So, for example, how does a civil society leader convince their board, their staff, their stakeholders that climate action is a positive thing rather than a kind of cross to be borne? Caroline, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I think there's lots of things that I'm really interested in, sort of theories of narrative change around, moving away from this thing that it's top down. The experts say this, and therefore the politicians need to do this, and trying to think more about how everyone has a role to play. That's something which some of the narrative change experts are really, really good at, having stories of us all in it together, working together. This is what happens when everyone plays their important role. And people like Joanna Macy and the sort of active hope theory, which is about you should be hopeful, but not just mindlessly hopeful. You should be taking action and thinking about the role that everyone has to play in order to be hopeful for the future. So to answer the question, Andrew, it's in terms of making that compelling, convincing case to do something. I think you already need to be thinking, what do we already do? Where do we already have opportunities? And this is really a way of using this moment in time to do what we do better and to do what we do more effectively, and to have even more impact on our existing objectives and our existing beneficiaries, for want of a better word. So there's definitely something about turning that turning the model on its head. It's not about engaging in the top-down narratives. It's about doing what we already do and creating more impact because of it. I really like what someone said in the chat about this, the climate crisis being, I think, something like the moment in time, or the sort of the context that we are living through. So it's not an issue. It's just the era. So yeah, I think that's really powerful, and that's the way to frame it. That's the way to cost it up. That's the way to have that, you know, almost that business case for doing something and getting involved.
And Mamta, does that approach hold with grassroots communities as well? So that might be the way that we might talk to our board of trustees about it and convince other stakeholders. But is it just the same way to communicate with, you know, the beneficiaries of your charity or civil society organization, or is there a different approach to sort of convince them of the importance of climate action?
One thing that I've learned that working with the community is that they know it better than you, for sure. You know, it's their lives and they're dealing with it every single day. I think it's a traditional mix of, it's a typical mix of science and traditional knowledge, if I may say so. It applies to medicine, it applies to education. If you look, just as an example, if you look into the entire indigenous wisdom, I don't think that we can tell them anything. They will tell us. And I think we need to really recognize, understand, and respect that. Working with the community, again, it's my own experience. I have been engaged in, you know, flood relief. You know, we've been engaged in areas of drought. Have been engaged in by migration is happening because of recurrent floods and droughts, extreme heat in slums while working in the slum area. And I think that it is about having the conversation with the community to kind of understand from them their perspective on climate action or climate change. And you will inherently find that they're coming, your narrative and their narrative is the same. Once again, it comes to narrative building. Once again, it comes back to communication. I feel it is very important to first, you know, kind of realize and streamline within ourselves that they know it better. They know it better. Once you do that, your questions and awareness, increase awareness of what's happening at a global level. So I think talking about climate change in isolation of the science can sometimes be it can kind of take you away from reality. It looks like something different that you're coming up. At the community level, to kind of build this whole narrative and bring us all together on climate action, I think it is important that we have the right narrative and storytelling, and we hear it from them, and we build the stories that they are telling. And actually, we take those stories and take it to the, you know, the global world, the scientific world, and tell them, here's what they are telling you. This is evidence. They will give you the evidence. Sometimes it's just a mind shift. Like we were working with about 300 farmers, women farmers in northeastern part of the country, where basically women are never recognized as farmers. They don't have land rights, etc., etc. In that, and it's a flood-prone area. Every year there is flood there. And while working on these issues, we were not even at that point of thinking about climate change. You know, over a year of time, every time a flood comes, everything is washed off. You know, looking at productivity, we were moving to climate resilient agriculture in itself. It is at that point that somebody has to recognize that this is climate action in practice. And then I think even your strategy, even your board, or the community will kind of, you do not need to convince them that this is what it is happening. With the community, you need to just have the right conversation. That's what I feel.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because I think you've both talked in different ways about the importance of narrative and the importance of storytelling. Do you think there's a sense in which that's one of the reasons why civil society leaders are a little bit fearful of getting into this, because they've not got the narrative straight in their own heads? Caroline, you talked about community dialogue earlier. Is there a sense in which, as a civil society leader, you've got to have this conversation, but you know that climate change is kind of not far off one of these sort of culture war issues? Are people just scared of talking about it, Caroline?
I would say that there's a number of very prevalent public narratives that can influence all of us, and it's really hard to separate, what we're doing from those narratives. So I did a piece of work on the sort of common narratives about climate change that can be harmful a couple of years ago, and there's definitely something about we're too small to make a difference as individuals or as small community groups. Like this is just too big, and someone with lots and lots of resources like the government or international coalitions should just take care of it. Or there's something about other people not caring. Other people don't care. This is something which actually turns off people from what we're doing. So maybe we shouldn't get involved with it. Things like it's other people's fault. Big business, governments, they've caused this, so they can fix it. So there's lots of common shortcuts that you can turn to justify why not. But on the other hand, I think especially over the last few years, there's also lots and lots of stories and messages that build much more positive narratives about the ability of everyone to take action in their own spaces. So I think it is easy to be turned off by things, but I think we have got to a level of sophistication where it's not just running scared from the slightly tricky issues that we have to navigate. And I would definitely pick up on something that Mamta said earlier, which is often it is civil society which picks up the brunt of it all. And if there's flooding, if there's heat waves, if there's sort of rising energy bills, all of this stuff, it's civil society organisations that have to deal with that. So actually anything that prevents these things getting worse or tries to improve the system for the future is something which works in the interests of civil society. So it's a sort of like what's the case not to do it. The costs of inaction are actually greater than the costs of doing something about it now, which we're all bearing anyway.
I'm glad you mentioned that point about climate change not being civil society's fault, and therefore why should we do anything about it? I was going to ask that question, and I think it is a truism, isn't it, that everything that civil society does really is kind of mopping up a problem that's been caused by someone else, whether it be governments, corporations, or individual choice or whatever. So really interesting to hear you say that. So just there are a few questions in the Q&A which I will come to in a second because time is slowly ticking away. But I just wanted to ask one more question on the theme of cost, because obviously, our overarching question is about can we afford to do this? There's a statistic from the Environmental Funders Network that estimates that only around 6% of giving by UK-based trusts and foundations goes to environmental issues. So where is all this money going to come from for civil society to act on climate change, Mamta?
I'm glad you've asked this question, because I think even within the funding community, among the funders and donors and philanthropists, there is a huge awareness that is required that climate change or climate urgency is not a box in itself, and that it is highly and very much linked and integrated into every area of work that they are doing. I think it is also about having this conversation and kind of building again a narrative even in the donor community about how what they do, everything, whether it is education, whether it is health, whether it is even pure environmental forest protection, let's say, every single thing, every single one of them are intricately part of, will become much more important as we move around because of the climate crisis. And now there is enough evidence. Now no more is it about global south. We look at what's happening in the north. You have wildfires, you have typhoons, you have hurricanes. I think that climate change and the climate crisis is out there right in front of us. Yes, it's something that is, everybody is is dreadful of it. But I think that it is high time we need to get our optimism in place, particularly even within the donor community as well. And that optimism is in different way. One is narratives, the right narratives. The second is the right mindset to understand these interlinkages between climate change and what they want to invest in, where they are putting in the money. And if you will map it, if you map it, you will find that climate vulnerable areas are where most poverty is, lack of education, all of that, this is there. So I don't think it is something different that they need to deal with. It's not something new that they want to learn. It's not something, it is very much part of everything that they are doing. And therefore, it is not about creating a new idea, a new stream of funding. It is about getting the right narrative, even in their funding area. How are they prioritizing their investment? Are they really funding in climate vulnerable areas? Can donors really look at what's happening? Are they ensuring inclusion of marginalized voices into the work that they are funding? These are small changes in approaches that you need to make if you really want to, sorry, that's thunder and lightning out here. I don't know if you can hear it, but it's going to rain out here. So yeah, so that's something that I feel is important for perspectives to change. And then if you come to the optimism part, entrepreneurship, green, sustainable entrepreneurship is an amazing area of work where there should be funding coming too. And that's livelihood, that's resilience, that's building, that's taking the economy towards a green economy. So I think there needs to be more education, if I may use the word, amongst the donor community on how climate change is not a box out there, but very much a part of what they are dealing with.
Yeah, thanks, Mamta. I mean, I feel quite positive that that UK funders are starting to realise that, but it's very much a kind of journey, isn't it? It's a slow burn, I think, at the moment. We've got 10 minutes left. I'm going to turn to the questions that have been put in the Q&A. I'm going to start with this one about the positive story of co-benefits. So we've talked about how co-benefits, it's an appealing narrative, but does it risk leaving people unaware about the scale of the problems that we're heading towards without huge change? So how do we get people to engage with this without scaring them away? So I suppose it's a question about, if you make everything sound too positive, everybody sits back and thinks, oh, we don't need to do everything. If you make it sound too scary, everybody becomes paralyzed and thinks, oh my God, we we can't act. Where's the sort of sweet middle spot? Caroline, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I think it's a really important consideration, and it's something which is always this contrast between urgency and pragmatism, or reaching people where they are versus bringing them on the journey. And I've heard policy makers talk about this, business leaders talk about this, civil society, it obviously applies to as well. It's that sort of where is the balance. And I think there is something about using, we shouldn't just blindly go, oh yeah, there's going to be lots of benefit, but it'll all be okay in the end. On the other hand, we can't just invoke fear and then let people drown in that fear. There's an emotional journey which you sort of need to take people on. I linked a piece of work in the chat that we did on sort of harnessing the power of climate emotions without leaving people behind, because they feel so overwhelmed and numbed and sort of just in a state of anxiety from climate change, so that they are just left immobile and unable to act, right? So there is something about awakening and educating about the scale of the problem, but just doing that will leave people inactive. And actually, you need to take people through the journey of understanding what it is that they can influence, what is in their power to change, how they can play their role in the system shift that we need, and then how we are all in this together. And it's very kind of immobilizing to say every individual should do their bit, you should all turn your lights off, because you can't see how any of that is going to fix the big picture. So that's sort of the story of us rather than the story of you is really important to engage with people. So it's important, it should all work as part of the same journey, and we shouldn't just talk about the scale and the urgency and the bad stuff without having a really, really clear picture about how we can move forward from that.
Can I just add one more thing on this, one more layer? I think optimism doesn't mean inaction. You can't be just optimistic and stay quiet. Optimism always includes action. Just energy, the truth about just energy is only possible to witness if we take the action. So I think that it is just not about, and it's a process. Remember, it's a process. Come on, we took decades to destroy and bring us to the brink of extinction. Let's be patient and give enough time to what will heal us and heal the planet. So these are very important. We must remember that optimism is action. It is not inaction at all.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to question about how we can work together next. We are short of time, but I'm going to try and squeeze these in. But if you could try and be, this is a big question, but if you could try and be brief in answering this one. I'm just going to read it out. So there's plenty of evidence on the importance of empowering communities and community-led collective change in tackling the climate crisis, and lots of great examples of local climate action, as you've both pointed out. But often locally led change is constrained and hampered by wider policies and systems, cutting across wide-ranging policy areas. How can civil society work together to expose and break down those constraints and blockers? And that's to either one of you, whoever wants to take that one.
Okay, I can try. So I think that what we need to do, that first thing, is break the silos in which we are working. The silos have to be broken, and we need to come together and work as a collective. And there is power in collective. That's one. There is strength in numbers. That's number two. A small attempt that we are trying to do in She Changes Climate is through the She Changes Climate Country Network. And this is exactly what we are trying to do, is to basically bring together different leaders and women-led organizations who are working on climate and related issues in remote parts, never getting together, never having a safe platform to kind of learn and share from each other, and to build the collective agenda for advocacy from that. So I think that breaking the silos is most important.
Yep, couldn't agree more. And I think it's, getting people to work together means understanding that they are working on the same issue. This is where the term climate change and climate crisis does come in handy, because actually, if there is, action happening on nature and biodiversity loss over there, and then community powered renewables over there, and someone else doing something on green jobs, that is all part of the same response to the context in which we're living, and should be seen as part of the same movement.
That's great, thank you. A final question, this one's for Mamta. Mamta, do you agree with Kate Raworth's donut economics model? If more places adopted this approach, do you think it would lead to more equitable outcomes?
I agree to it, but I think that what is important is the local context. We remember that one fits all solution model doesn't work, but it's a very strong model for sure. The beauty and the strength lies in how do you really cultivate it in the context that you want it to apply it. Very short answer to, I would love to have a separate conversation on this, but yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, we could probably spend a whole hour just
exactly
discussing different models and which work and which don't, but we are sadly very close to running out of time. So I'm just going to wrap up. I want to say a huge thank you to Mamta and Caroline for that really insightful discussion. I was particularly struck by what you both said about listening to and trusting communities to understand about climate change and for them to frame what action should take. So, I think we as civil society leaders, we are here because we want to help and support communities, but we sometimes slip into this mindset of thinking we have to solve the problem for them. And I think we all know that that's not the most sustainable way of tackling any societal issue. I hope everyone watching will have also found the discussion interesting. I hope it will inspire people to take action on climate change in their own organisations. I think that we've seen that even though there may be challenges and barriers and even financial costs to taking climate change, the benefits of doing so and the potential future cost savings vastly outweigh any concerns about present day affordability. So to loop back round to the question that we posed today, can civil society afford to care about climate change? I think the answer that we've ended up with, which I kind of hoped is where we'd land, is that we can't afford not to care about climate change. Taking action is not only the right thing to do, the urgent imperative, but it's also the economically sensible thing to do, and is something that every charity and voluntary organisation should be building into their strategic plans and day-to-day operations right now, today. So on that note, I'd like to thank you all again for watching today. I'd like to remind you that tomorrow, Wednesday, the 11th of September at midday, 12 p.m, ACEVO Chief Exec Jane Ide will be live on LinkedIn with Ariba Hamid, who is the Joint Executive Director at Greenpeace UK. If you visit acevo.org.uk/climate-week, you'll find more details there, and also a link to a short survey where you can share your thoughts and challenges in relation to climate change, help shape the conversation over the course of Climate Week. So thank you again. I hope you all enjoyed that, and carry on the conversations in your own organisation. Thank you.